In more than 4 years, the automaker CEO seeming to break ranks with much of corporate America right now, delivering some harsh words about President Trump's tariff plans.
Ford has put the brakes on building its new $3.5 billion Blue Oval battery plant in Marshall.
This is a president who views this auto tariff as a way to reshape American manufacturing and maybe, by extension, reshape American society more broadly to bring back a lot of jobs.
Ford just detonated a bomb inside the American auto industry. In one brutal move, they announced plans to shift electric vehicle production overseas, killing jobs, tanking the stock market, and betraying the very workers who built their empire. The fallout was immediate. Trump launched a full-scale political assault, calling it the ultimate betrayal of American labor. Now the U.S. economy teeters on a knife's edge. What was supposed to be a strategic business decision has spiraled into a $302 billion economic firestorm. Will Ford survive the political backlash? Will Trump unleash full retaliation? Or has the U.S. just lost control of its own auto industry? Trump's fury unleashed. Donald Trump fired back within 24 hours of Ford's announcement. At a rally, he blasted the automaker, accusing it of betraying American workers. Ford has betrayed the American worker, Trump roared, jabbing the air for emphasis. They're sending your jobs to other countries while you pick up the pieces. We built Ford. This country built Ford. The crowd erupted not with shock, but with a sense of righteous anger. To them, Trump wasn't overreacting. He was voicing the betrayal they all felt. But Trump's response wasn't just emotional, it was deeply calculated. Almost immediately, he launched a multi-pronged offensive. Conservative media was flooded with op-eds and talking heads calling for boycotts. Hashtags trended, petitions circulated. Behind the scenes, Trump's allies in Congress began drafting proposals to revoke federal subsidies for automakers that outsourced jobs. You think that was wild? What comes next shook the markets to their core. But before we get into that, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Economic shockwave. The political storm wasn't the only explosion triggered by Ford's bombshell. The economic shockwave came next. By the end of the following week, Wall Street had reacted decisively and brutally. Ford's stock took a nosedive, dragging down auto industry equities across the board. Over $302 billion in market value vanished in mere days. Investors were not just worried about Ford's strategy. They were terrified by the growing political volatility and looming trade war. But it wasn't just numbers on a screen. In Ford factories across America, from Detroit to Louisville to Kansas City, the announcement hit like a funeral bell. Rumors spread through break rooms and shop floors. Would layoffs follow? Were plants about to close? For workers who had clocked in every day for 30 years, the uncertainty was gut-wrenching. Some cried. Others raged. Most were just stunned. For many, this wasn't just a job, it was a legacy. Fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters had all worked under the same roof, building not just vehicles, but lives. Now they were being told that the future of that legacy lay somewhere else. And as Ford scrambled to reassure the markets with talk of new global partnerships and cost-saving measures, those words rang hollow in the homes of American workers. They had heard it all before. Words didn't pay mortgages, promises didn't protect pensions, and the factory lights didn't stay on with corporate spin. For investors, it was a lesson in risk. For workers, it was a lesson in betrayal. And together, their pain formed a new kind of pressure. The kind that doesn't go away. The kind that builds. The kind that explodes. The political and cultural bomb. Outsourcing is not new. America has endured wave after wave of offshoring since the 1990s, from steel to shoes to smartphones. But Ford's move cut deeper. Why? Because it came at a moment when the very idea of American manufacturing was being redefined. In the middle of an electric vehicle revolution, a once-in-a-century industrial shift, Ford had a chance to lead a rebirth of domestic innovation. Instead, it walked away. This wasn't just a company chasing profits. It felt like a rejection of something sacred. The betrayal wasn't just economic, it was cultural. Ford had long symbolized American strength, durability, and pride. It was the company that put the nation on wheels, the brand that survived depressions, wars, and recessions. To see it now turn its back on the country that built it was, for many, unbearable. It tapped into a much deeper anxiety. The fear that the American century is over, that the jobs are gone, that the future belongs to someone else. In a country already torn by political tribalism and economic inequality, Ford's decision poured gasoline on the fire. And because this betrayal came not from a foreign competitor, but from within, it hit differently. This wasn't China stealing jobs, this was America surrendering them. That's why the backlash was so swift so passionate and so personal. In the end, this was never just about electric vehicles or factory shifts. It was about something far more fundamental. It was about who we are, what we value, and whether American industry still has a place in the American dream. And as the battle lines hardened, one thing became clear. This fight was far from over. Next, the economic earthquake spreads beyond Ford into the broader system that made this betrayal possible: the EV market meltdown. The electric vehicle market was hailed as the golden path to automotive salvation for years. Automakers rushed to build battery-powered fleets. Analysts projected exponential growth, and environmentalists celebrated the shift as a new industrial revolution. But now the honeymoon is over. The electric vehicle boom is unraveling at the worst possible time for Ford Motor Company, and the consequences have forced it into a move so drastic, so politically dangerous, that it may go down as the most controversial decision in its history. It started subtly, a few headlines about slow-moving EVs sitting on dealer lots. Then the numbers came in. Sales of electric vehicles in the United States grew by just a fraction in the last fiscal quarter, failing to meet even the most conservative projections. Meanwhile, inventory ballooned. Dealerships, once scrambling to meet demand, now reported electric trucks and crossovers collecting dust. Why? Because the American consumer had changed. Rising interest rates made financing a new electric vehicle feel like taking on a second mortgage. And unlike gas-powered cars, which can rely on a century of fueling infrastructure, electric vehicles are tethered to an unreliable patchwork of charging stations. Range anxiety remains a real fear, especially in rural states where public chargers are few and far between. And then there was inflation. Battery costs, instead of falling as expected, surged. The prices of lithium, cobalt, and nickel climbed steadily, cutting deep into profit margins. Ford's massive investment into EV manufacturing was suddenly a liability. The company faced a brutal choice: either swallow the costs and risk bleeding billions, or shift production to lower-cost regions overseas. This is the backdrop against which Ford made its controversial call to offshore a significant portion of its electric vehicle manufacturing. Far from a strategic leap forward, this was a survival maneuver in the face of collapsing consumer enthusiasm, surging material costs, and stagnating revenue. Ford did what it believed it had to do. But in doing so, it may have opened a new chapter in a political and economic war far bigger than any one company. And that brings us to the heart of the controversy. Ford's decision wasn't just about factories or forecasts. It was about following something far more critical than flags or borders. Ford's real strategy: follow the battery, not the flag. To truly understand Ford's decision, we must stop looking at it through a patriotic lens. This wasn't about betraying American workers or challenging national identity, at least not directly. It was about following the batteries, and the batteries, it turns out, are not in Michigan. Ford's electric vehicle survival hinges on battery supply, and the most affordable, scalable, and stable supplies of lithium-ion cells come from Asia. China, South Korea, and to a lesser extent, Japan, have built a global battery empire. From mineral extraction to cell production, these countries dominate every critical step of the supply chain. The United States, meanwhile, is playing catch-up. While domestic battery factories are being built, they remain expensive, underdeveloped, and subject to political tug-of-war. Ford cannot afford to wait. With battery costs accounting for as much as 40% of an EV's total cost, the company must go where the savings are. And that's not all. Foreign governments have rolled out a red carpet for companies like Ford. Vietnam, South Korea, and even China offer aggressive subsidies, tax breaks, and streamlined permitting to lure automakers. These are incentives that the U.S. either cannot or will not match. In places like Thailand and Indonesia, entire battery parks are being built overnight with Chinese backing, something that would take years of bureaucratic wrangling in the States. Ford's pivot overseas is less about betrayal and more about math. Producing electric vehicles in countries with established battery infrastructure, cheap labor, and government support allows Ford to maintain price competitiveness in a market that is both volatile and unforgiving. Every decision, from material sourcing to assembly, is being driven by the brutal economics of the EV era. It is a business-first strategy that may keep Ford afloat, but at the cost of a political firestorm back home. And now that firestorm has a name: Donald Trump. Trump's counteroffensive. Donald Trump did not waste time. Within hours of Ford's announcement, he was on stage at a campaign rally, denouncing the company in terms usually reserved for enemies of the state. But this time, it was not just angry rhetoric. It was a declaration of political war, and behind it is a rapidly forming policy machine, designed to punish Ford in ways that sting. The president and current Republican frontrunner has proposed a sweeping new tariff regime targeting vehicles manufactured overseas, especially electric vehicles. The plan? Impose a punitive tax on any EV built outside the United States, even if it's by an American company. These tariffs would, in Trump's words, level the playing field by eliminating the cost advantage of foreign production. But that's just the beginning. Trump allies in Congress are drafting proposals to revoke federal tax credits for electric vehicles that do not meet strict domestic manufacturing thresholds. These credits, worth up to $7,500 per vehicle, are a cornerstone of the EV market's growth strategy. If they disappear for Ford products, it could crush demand and drive buyers into the arms of competitors. Behind the scenes, Trump-affiliated political action committees are reportedly pressuring lawmakers and governors in swing states to oppose any new Ford factory developments unless the company pledges to build on U.S. soil. This strategy, combining federal leverage with grassroots mobilization, is a powerful weapon. It turns Ford's political liabilities into local electoral flashpoints. But this isn't just about Trump. It's about the alliances forming beneath him. Labor unions, political factions, and voter blocs are coalescing around a common enemy. And that brings us to the next front in this escalating war. Because while Trump is fighting Ford in Washington, someone else is preparing to strike in Detroit. Labor's revenge. Ford may have calculated the political fallout of moving EV production overseas, but it vastly underestimated the wrath of the United Auto Workers. Less than 1 year after winning record-breaking labor contracts through strategic strikes, the UAW now finds itself staring down what it sees as a betrayal in broad daylight. The union spent months negotiating higher wages, job security, and electric vehicle transition guarantees with Ford executives. Now, with Ford shifting a major portion of that production to Asia, union leaders feel the rug has been pulled out from under them. Their message is clear. If Ford thinks it can sidestep American labor, it has another thing coming. Talks of renewed strikes are already underway. The union is considering walkouts at key domestic facilities, including battery assembly plants and EV-related R&D centers. These strikes would not only damage Ford's already fragile supply chain, but also cripple its ability to pivot back to American production if political pressure mounts. The UAW is not alone. It has started rallying other unions to the cause, including the Teamsters and various aerospace and manufacturing workers groups. A coordinated labor movement targeting Ford could create a public relations nightmare, especially as the company tries to sell itself as both forward-thinking and worker-friendly. The union is also making moves on Capitol Hill. UAW leaders are lobbying pro-labor members of Congress to introduce legislation that penalizes automakers who offshore EV production after receiving federal subsidies. Their argument is simple: taxpayer money should not fund corporate outsourcing. This is not just about contracts or wages anymore. For the UAW, this is existential. The union sees electric vehicles as the future of the American auto industry. If those vehicles are built overseas, the entire labor foundation collapses. In short, Ford has backed itself into a corner. It is now being squeezed from both ends, the political right by Trump and the labor left by the UAW. It gambled on global economics and got caught in a domestic war. And as both sides prepare to escalate, the economic aftershocks are just beginning to hit the rest of the auto industry. Ford's brand is under siege. Ford isn't just battling politics or investor nerves, it's facing mass consumer rejection. A single announcement sparked a grassroots revolt, spreading from online forums to local communities, dealerships, and loyal buyers. The brand, once tied to American strength, is now accused of turning its back on it. Across social media platforms, conservative influencers have launched coordinated campaigns to shame Ford for its decision to offshore electric vehicle production. The hashtags boycott Ford, Ford sells out are trending. Posts featuring Ford trucks being defaced, covered in flags, or simply traded in for competitor vehicles have gone viral. These are not isolated incidents. They reflect a real and growing cultural rejection, fueled by a belief that Ford has turned its back on the American worker. What makes this revolt even more dangerous is its diversity. It is not just die-hard Trump supporters voicing their outrage. It is also middle-class families, union workers, local dealerships, and former brand evangelists. Ford has long enjoyed cross-generational loyalty in the heartland, from grandfathers who swore by the F-Series to grandkids saving up for a Mustang. This was a brand that represented continuity and trust, That trust is cracking fast. Ford dealerships are reporting sharp declines in foot traffic. Sales staff are being forced to answer difficult questions they never anticipated. Customers want to know whether their future vehicles will be made in America. Some are demanding alternative models built domestically, while others are simply walking out the door. For dealerships, especially in red states, this backlash is already eating into quarterly revenue projections. The economic cost is just the start. The reputational damage is incalculable. Ford has spent over 100 years building an identity tied to American manufacturing. One announcement has put all of that at risk. If this revolt spreads, it may take more than rebranding or discounts to win buyers back. But the revolt is not only from the outside. As Ford fights to survive the consumer backlash, a second war is breaking out within its own walls. Death of the dealership. As Ford battles the fury of consumers and political firestorms, it is simultaneously waging a quieter but equally dangerous war against its own dealer network. For over a century, dealerships have been Ford's lifeblood, moving inventory, maintaining relationships, and providing customer service across thousands of communities. But with the rise of electric vehicles, Ford is adopting a direct-to-consumer sales model that bypasses dealers entirely. And dealers are not going quietly. Under the new model, Ford plans to sell its electric vehicles online through a simplified digital interface. Pricing will be fixed. Inventory will be centrally managed. Dealers will no longer negotiate prices or maintain large vehicle lots. To Ford, this is the future, a streamlined, efficient system modeled after Tesla. But for dealers, it feels like betrayal. Many invested millions in showrooms, service bays, and staff based on an entirely different business model. Now, those investments are at risk of becoming obsolete. The pushback has already begun. Lawsuits have been filed in multiple states, challenging Ford's right to implement the new sales system without violating franchise agreements. Lobbyists are working overtime to pass legislation in state capitals that would block or limit direct-to-consumer vehicle sales. This battle is not theoretical. In states like Texas, Florida, and Missouri, the legal fights are heating up. Ford's leadership argues that the market is changing and that the company must adapt to survive. But this logic does little to comfort the thousands of small business owners who make up Ford's dealership network. They see a future where they are cut out of the picture entirely, turned from partners into logistics centers, or worse, eliminated altogether. This internal conflict adds yet another layer to Ford's crisis. It is not just fighting the federal government or angry consumers. It is fighting the very institutions that helped make it a global powerhouse. And as these battles intensify, the comparison to past industry failures grows harder to ignore. Ghosts of Pontiac and Saturn. Anyone who has followed the history of the American auto industry knows what happens when companies misjudge the market, alienate their customers, and lose the support of their stakeholders. The ghosts of Pontiac and Saturn still haunt General Motors. Once celebrated brands, they were sacrificed during the economic collapse of 2008, not because they lacked quality, but because the market lost confidence in their relevance and viability. Pontiac was once a cultural icon, known for its muscle cars and brash identity. Saturn, on the other hand, was marketed as a new kind of car company, one that offered simplicity, innovation, and consumer-friendly pricing. Yet, when General Motors faced financial turmoil, both brands were axed. Dealerships were shuttered. Inventory was liquidated. Consumer confidence collapsed. The causes were complex: economic recession, poor corporate strategy, shifting consumer preferences. But the end result was clear: irreparable brand damage followed by total collapse. Now, many are asking, is Ford setting itself up for a similar fate? The warning signs are there. Ford's aggressive EV shift, combined with its alienation of dealerships and abandonment of domestic manufacturing, mirrors the kind of overreach that doomed Pontiac and Saturn. It is making radical changes in a volatile market, at a time when consumer trust is fragile and competition is rising. Ford is not just competing against Tesla, General Motors, and Toyota. It is competing against history. And history has shown that even the strongest brands can fall when they stray too far from their core identity. If Ford loses its brand loyalty, its dealer support, and its American-made image all at once, it may not have a second chance. But Ford's challenges are not just domestic. As the company moves EV production overseas, a larger strategic question is emerging. Who will control the future of electric vehicles? The manufacturing surrender. Ford's decision to offshore electric vehicle production is not just about saving money. It is about a long-term structural shift that may change the balance of power in the global automotive industry. And the uncomfortable truth is this: in trying to survive, Ford may have handed China the keys to the kingdom. Modern electric vehicles depend on a few critical components: lithium-ion batteries, rare earth minerals, and advanced chipsets. The overwhelming majority of these materials and technologies are controlled by China. By moving production closer to Chinese supply chains, Ford is gaining access to cheaper inputs, but also increasing its dependency on a geopolitical rival. This is not speculation. Ford has signed sourcing deals with Chinese battery manufacturers. It is investing in joint ventures in countries with close economic ties to Beijing. In doing so, it is entangling its future with a supply chain dominated by Chinese companies and regulatory frameworks. While the business logic is clear: cut costs, reduce volatility, accelerate production, the strategic risk is enormous. Ford is not just shifting production, it is shifting power. And as China expands its EV manufacturing capacity and asserts greater control over global battery markets, Ford may find itself boxed in. In the long run, this could mean American automakers are no longer masters of their own supply chains. They could become second-tier players in an industry increasingly dictated by Chinese policy, pricing, and priorities. The stakes are bigger than Ford. This is about whether the United States will continue to play a leading role in the automotive world, or whether that role has already been forfeited. And as the fallout spreads, foreign automakers and foreign governments are watching closely, because they may be next in line to capitalize on the chaos Ford has left behind. The EU strikes back. While American automakers battle political storms at home, the European Union has quietly created a regulatory fortress that is locking out their biggest rivals from across the Atlantic. Ford, General Motors, Jeep, and Ram have all struggled. Not because of weak demand, but because of unrelenting emissions standards, vehicle size restrictions, and legal scrutiny that make it nearly impossible for large American vehicles to succeed. This is not a coincidence. It is a calculated defense of Europe's domestic industry, dressed in the language of climate action and public safety. The first wall American automakers run into is the European Union's carbon emission standards. These rules are not just guidelines, they are mandates with real financial penalties. Cars sold in the European Union must meet strict fleet average emissions targets, or face hefty fines. And while some European brands have smaller city cars and hybrids to balance out their emissions, U.S. brands like Ford and Jeep tend to lean heavily on gas-powered SUVs and pickup trucks. Even plug-in hybrids, such as the Jeep Wrangler 4xe, are not enough to offset the emissions of larger models. Then come the taxes. Many European countries impose vehicle registration or ownership taxes based on weight, horsepower, or carbon dioxide output. A full-size pickup like the Ford F-150 or Ram 1500 may face annual fees in the thousands of euros simply because of their size. These financial disincentives make American vehicles not only uncompetitive, but in many cases, unwanted. Even loyal import fans begin to look elsewhere when the taxes stack up. On top of that, there is a growing hostility toward large vehicles in urban areas. Major cities across Europe, from Paris to Brussels to Amsterdam, are implementing SUV bans in dense districts, increasing toll fees for heavy vehicles, or outright barring certain models based on emissions. American automakers have no room to maneuver when the very design language they use, bigger, louder, tougher, clashes with European city planning and environmental priorities. And it is not just emissions and taxes. Regulatory compliance is another slow-bleeding wound. Every region of the European Union has different safety requirements, pedestrian protection standards, and noise regulations that must be individually addressed. American vehicles often need expensive retrofitting to even be eligible for sale. This increases costs, slows rollout, and ultimately discourages U.S. brands from even trying. The result: Ford has scaled back its presence. General Motors sold Opel and walked away. Jeep and Ram continue to try, but they do so with niche models and minimal success. Europe has not banned American cars outright, but they have made it so painful to compete that the message is clear: stay out. And it is working. But while Europe is closing the door, Asia is walking right through the front gate. Asia's advantage. As American automakers stagger through global crises, Japan and South Korea are operating on a completely different level. Toyota, Honda, Hyundai, and Kia have not only survived the transition to electrification and globalization, they have thrived. These companies have struck a balance that U.S. manufacturers have failed to master, being global businesses that still feel local in every market. The secret? Flexibility and foresight. While Ford and General Motors gambled everything on a fast EV rollout, Japanese companies took a cautious, hybrid-first approach. Toyota's emphasis on hybrid electric vehicles allowed it to meet emissions targets in dozens of countries without depending on expensive and volatile EV battery supply chains. Consumers who were not ready to switch fully to electric cars could still enjoy efficiency and savings without the range anxiety. This gave Toyota and Honda breathing room while others scrambled. Meanwhile, Hyundai and Kia have aggressively expanded their fully electric lineup, launching models like the Hyundai Ioniq and Kia EV6 to global acclaim. But they did so with an important twist. They invested in U.S. manufacturing at the same time. By building massive new plants in states like Georgia and Alabama, South Korean automakers positioned themselves as allies to American workers, even as they benefited from free trade and lower global supply costs. This duality is their greatest advantage. When Toyota says, "Built in America," it means it. When Hyundai promotes its EV lineup, it can point to both domestic jobs and international reach. American buyers are drawn to that patriotic appeal. Foreign regulators are reassured by their compliance, and investors see companies that avoided both the political volatility of Trump-era tariffs and the labor unrest facing Detroit. Japan and South Korea also enjoy more stable supply chains and closer coordination with their governments. Strategic public investment in battery research, semiconductor manufacturing, and export logistics gives them a structural edge that U.S. automakers simply cannot replicate without political chaos. It is not just that these companies build good cars, it is that their entire ecosystems are built for 21st century competition. As Ford stumbles and Trump rallies the base, Asian automakers are watching, adapting, and expanding. And they are doing it without making enemies at home or abroad. But there is another player in this story who is not playing fair at all: China's endgame. While politicians in Washington talk tough on China, Beijing is playing a much longer, more calculated game. And it is winning. Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers have discovered the ultimate loophole: build their factories not in China, but in Mexico, and use the US-Mexico-Canada agreement to gain access to the American market without facing the steep tariffs or import restrictions. This is not a theory. It is already happening. Companies like BYD, NIO, and even smaller brands like XPeng are quietly setting up shop south of the border. With low labor costs, proximity to American highways, and favorable trade terms, Mexico offers a perfect launching pad for Chinese EVs to flood the U.S. market. The vehicles are assembled in Mexico, meet regional content requirements, and then enter American showrooms with price tags U.S. automakers cannot match. Even more alarming, Chinese automakers have technological advantages that American companies are still trying to catch up with. BYD, for example, has its own battery production, vertical integration from raw materials to final assembly, and state support that shields it from market volatility. By building in Mexico, it removes the last major barrier to competing directly with Ford, Tesla, and General Motors on American soil. Ford may be shifting production overseas, but China is shifting entire supply chains to America's doorstep. And if U.S. policy does not change, the result will be devastating. American factories will be undercut, dealerships will face a flood of cheaper competition, and consumers, enticed by low-cost, high-tech options, will be hard-pressed to say no. While Trump talks tariffs and Ford tries damage control, China is making its quiet move. A move that could redefine the entire North American auto economy. The back door is open, and they are walking through it. But this is not just about China or the European Union, or even Asia. It is about a global industry that is moving on without America. The world versus America. The battle over Ford's EV production decision is not an isolated story. It is a symptom of a much larger crisis. The growing divide between how the world builds cars and how the United States clings to its past. As globalization accelerates, American automakers are trapped in a political, cultural, and economic bind that may prove impossible to escape. Global car manufacturers are adapting faster, investing smarter, and expanding more aggressively. Meanwhile, the United States is locked in ideological warfare. On one side, the push for electric vehicles, global supply chains, and international trade. On the other, the demand for domestic jobs, industrial self-reliance, and economic nationalism. In this environment, U.S. automakers are getting crushed. They cannot compete on cost with China. They cannot meet emission standards in the European Union. They cannot match the political stability and manufacturing flexibility of Japan and South Korea. And they are losing public trust at home, caught between union strikes, political attacks, and confused messaging. The consequences are already visible. Factories shutter, stocks plummet, brands falter. And as the rest of the world races ahead with clean tech, high-efficiency vehicles, and intelligent infrastructure, America is debating whether building cars abroad is patriotic or not. The problem is not just Ford, it is the entire industry. Unless something changes, unless U.S. automakers find a way to navigate this global shift without alienating their own base, the future will belong to someone else. The battle lines are drawn, the world is moving forward, and America is standing at a crossroads. So now we want to hear from you. Do you think Ford betrayed America, or was this just smart business? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. And if you want more hard-hitting breakdowns just like this, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications.